Hello and good morning. Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be speaking about intelligent collection as the keystone to efficient e-discovery. My name is Jeremy Montz. There we are. I'm a product manager for K-Cura, working on our relativity legal hold and collection applications. And I'm joined today by my fellow panelists, Cheryl McKinnon of Forrester Research, and Bennett Borden, partner of Drinker, Biddle, and Reed. Bennett, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit more detail?
Sure. Hi. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Jeremy, for having me. I chair the firm's Information Governance and E-Discovery group, and so really live in this space all the time. I'm also one of the founders of the Information Governance Initiative, which is a new think tank on IG that K-Cura is a sponsor of. We'll be talking about some of their work that we've been doing today as well.
Thank you. And Cheryl, you'll be our first speaker. Perhaps you can introduce yourself as well once we get started. Just to quickly touch on our agenda for the day, we want to take a look at big data and what the effect of it has on e-discovery and in the business world at large. Discuss a few key and specific technological challenges of collection and some best practices for knowing where your data is and getting the right stuff. And then include the targeted collection as part of your overall e-discovery and information governance strategy. So we've got a lot to cover today, and with that, I will turn it over to Cheryl.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for including me to be a guest in your webinar today. So my name is Cheryl McKinnon. I'm a principal analyst with Forrester Research, and I cover aspects of e-discovery, information governance, as well as the broader enterprise content management and archiving market. So what I'd like to be able to talk about over the next few minutes is to talk about some of the key trends that we at Forrester are tracking in the e-discovery and governance market, to talk about some of the changes in the preservation and collection landscape and what it means for our enterprise customers. So we'll start with just kind of setting the stage here, and many of you are probably familiar with some of the key definitions coming from independent sources in the market, like the EDRM.net consortium. But what is e-discovery? I think this is a really helpful definition. You know, it's a process of identifying, preserving, collecting, processing, searching, reviewing, and producing electronically stored information that might be relevant in a civil, criminal, or regulatory manner. And, you know, I think the key component here is, as we start thinking about collection, as we start thinking about the important components of an information governance strategy, especially as we start entering this era of big data, this concept of thinking about electronically stored information as opposed to traditional definitions around documents versus records is increasingly important to the way that we view our internal and external content holdings. So electronically stored information is that discoverable information that is stored in any medium from which the information can be obtained, either directly or, if necessary, after the translation by the responding party into reasonably usable form. Now, I think as we start looking at the changing landscape of our information management practices, this concept of stored in any medium really is going to become more and more important for organizations. We are seeing that technology is changing the way that we communicate with customers, with colleagues, with peers. We're seeing that new sources of data are coming into our organizations from an ever-shifting set of sources, and we really need to be prepared for this. So, you know, looking at designing some good practices around e-discovery, collection, preservation, we do need to be aware of this concept that this stored in any medium is going to change the complexity and the flavor of the information that we need to keep an eye on. So some recent data from Forrester, this is one of the charts that we put together just a couple of months ago. It really tells us that our organizations are using data differently to start to glean business insights and make decisions. Now, we call this kind of taking a reset on the concept of big data, because it's not just about the complexity or the size or the number of sources of data that are newly available to our organization. So, if we rethink how we have addressed data sources in the past, if we think back a few years ago, we made inferences about how our products or services or customers were using information. We made assumptions. We didn't necessarily have everything we needed to really test and validate how we used information. The assumptions of years past was that data is scarce, it's expensive, it's easy to manage, perhaps because it sits in rows and columns, that it's structured and it gives us real insights into what's being done. But ultimately, collecting it and finding it was some of the challenge. Today, we're seeing that organizations are thinking about data and the variety of sources of data quite differently. We're trying to use different data sources to make decisions about what we think our customers or our colleagues or our partners are actually going to do in the market. We know that we have to become more efficient with how we make decisions and make them more quickly because our competitive landscape is so intense right now. We know that we have to balance the experience that we've gathered over the years, but blend that in with new approaches to quantitative analysis. So we're navigating different kinds of risks. And what this means from an e-discovery perspective is that we have to take a look around our business context, look at where our sales and marketing teams are using new forms of data. How are our product and services teams using new sources of data to make decisions about what to take to the market? So we need to build that awareness of where big data initiatives are being kicked off inside our organizations and know exactly what kind of data we need to be aware of from an e-discovery perspective. Tomorrow, we're going to continue to see that this world is going to change. More and more information is being made available, whether it's open data sources from our public sector agencies, or perhaps we're learning how to extract better data out of our log files, out of our sensor data, perhaps that's in our plants or our buildings, our facilities. So data is becoming much more plentiful, it's cheap, and it's becoming more and more difficult to manage it in traditional information or data governance approaches. We're also seeing that data is changing because it's becoming more messy and perhaps more text-based. So these lines between structured and unstructured data really is beginning to blur. So again, we have to really think about how our organizations are beginning to experiment with big data initiatives, understand the changing landscape of the information that we may need to be required to collect down the road.
You know, Cheryl, this has been I find your findings in this really interesting, and I think we're going to see a theme throughout as we discuss this today, this changing nature of the understanding of information and how that the awareness of it is being raised to a new level, to see it not just as repositories of documents or emails, but actually facts reside within those electronic pieces of information, and elucidating those facts for both business, regulatory, and legal purposes. We're just getting better at it. And it's very interesting to see how companies and clients are starting to make that transition, as some of your findings will show throughout this. And so it's what I think is very good news on the horizon, that companies are actually getting better at understanding that information is an asset that can be leveraged, and the technologies to do so are really starting to come in through the big data door. And secondarily through e-discovery, as we'll talk about, but I'm starting to see a new awareness among management, especially about the value and leveraging of information and the repurposing of the skill sets we have of managing and governing it for new kind of business purposes.
Sure, and I think, you know, this is going to help us from an e-discovery perspective. You know, if we see that organizations are beginning to see the value of, you know, more sources of data, both external and internal, it means we're able to start applying some of the better management principles much earlier in the life cycle, so that, you know, if it comes to the point where information needs to be part of an investigative case or subject to e-discovery, we need to be able to collect it. If we've been organizing it because we've been using it much more effectively for business decision making, then I think we're setting ourselves on a much more efficient path to e-discovery down the road by taking care of it really much more upstream. because when we see when we talk to our enterprise customers, these new sources of data coming into the organization. If you look at the left-hand side of the chart, there's so many new sources of data that are coming into our organization. Sometimes we're aware of it as e-discovery or governance professionals, and oftentimes we're not. We're getting data from our public sector agencies. The whole growth of open data initiatives across many levels of government mean that organizations are able to tap into these data feeds, whether they're downloadable spreadsheets or in some cases XML or other kinds of API feeds. And if we're blending these data sets together, perhaps from a federal level and a state or provincial level, it's really interesting. I mean, how do we actually bring that combined insight to the table when, and potentially is that something, if we make a business decision based on that combined data set, how do we capture that moment, that record of what the insights aggregate really brought to the table? So again, not just the sources of data, but how we're using it may actually start to change some of the complexity around how we look at that from a discovery and management perspective. We're also seeing the rise of various data brokers and aggregators. Companies actually are reselling some of their data after some level of anonymization or scrub, and these data brokers provide information about driving patterns, about buying patterns, loyalty card programs, etc. So these sources of data are coming into our organizations from external sources as well. And again, being able to tap into this whole new generation around marketing automation, for example. Any organization that's implemented a marketing automation tool, you're often very surprised at just how much behind-the-scenes data those tools are collecting, everything from click patterns on your company website to IP addresses, and this again introduces a whole new level of complexity around how do we protect and store that information if even it contains some personally identifiable information as well. So these new sources of data are coming into our organizations. We're analyzing it, we're finding new insights, and increasingly we're getting customers asking about, well, can I actually combine some of these new sources of data with my historical data, perhaps my email archive or other sets of records repositories, and kind of combine that historical awareness with this new real-time data coming in and kind of compare those two. So some really interesting areas here that we're seeing organizations begin to talk about, to explore. And in fact, talking to some of my enterprise customers, I've actually had a couple of customers ask, well, should we start rethinking some of our traditional retention policies in this era of big data, because we typically destroy some of this customer data, but now we think we could actually mine it for new insights. We didn't have the technologies years ago, but maybe this definition of business value is changed in light of this new generation of analytics.
It's really quite amazing to watch this transformation occur, right? I love the fact that companies are starting to, as you'll talk about on these next two slides, the interesting transition from e-discovery into more information governance perspective, right? Because, like as you say, this idea that information is an asset and leverageable, and using it in so many different ways that it's starting to be seen as a malleable thing. And basically what we as e-discovery people have learned is how to get value out of vast repositories of information. And so seeing that repurposing is really quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And to this next point, companies that have been able to operationalize more of their e-discovery processes, get more comfortable, kind of go up on their maturity model, are now starting to look at additional use cases, being able to use some of the same practices, lessons learned, and even technologies to not only worry about responding to e-discovery preservation orders and do the collections, but internal investigations. This has become a really interesting area. A lot of organizations are asking more about this. Can I start to mine some of my communication patterns, for example, and understand, are there pockets of bad behavior I can proactively, mitigate some of that risk, or make sure that retraining is happening so it doesn't end up in the courts down the road. So, trying to be much more proactive and move the needle into a proactive mitigation of risk versus dealing it once it actually is to the point where someone is threatening to sue someone. In public sector, a lot of the same technologies and approaches are being used to respond to freedom of information requests in public sector. Submissions to regulators, being able to very quickly collect and mine information. Perhaps there's a certain subset of, high-risk profile employees because of the nature of the work that they do, being able to hone in on them and being able to very quickly do those responses, in a matter of days or hours instead of weeks or months. Audit responses. And of course, increasingly, we're seeing that organizations are applying some of these collection and identification and analytic technologies in scenarios where companies are either merging and acquiring or perhaps spinning off new businesses, using these tools to understand, okay, what belongs with the parent company, what needs to be able to spin off into the new sister company, etc. So really interesting that I'm starting to hear more use cases in that M&A or divestiture activity as well.
Yeah, and sure, we're seeing a lot of this. This is what's really interesting about the convergence of what's going on in big data and what's going on in e-discovery, because really data analytics is all about finding patterns, and that's exactly what some of the newer technologies in e-discovery do. They find, especially in the predictive coding and predictive analytics space, you're finding documents that are like the stuff you're looking for. And starting to see those new use cases, like we've been working with clients on the internal investigation side and even the proactive compliance programs, as you say, actually using data sets that we have learned from prior violations or misconduct, and actually programming those into probability predictors of misconduct and actually trying to ferret out situations as they're developing or soon after they've developed in a much more proactive way. Similarly, in this merger and acquisition space, so we've been able to work with several clients who are the acquirer of companies that very soon after the acquisition of a company, we do basically a data pull and analysis to look for weaknesses or risks that weren't disclosed. And have had great success in purchase price adjustments or risk identification, again, driven by these people who see data as a tool to be leveraged. It's really quite interesting to watch how this greater understanding of information is starting to play out in these larger areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the other areas where organizations are making use of some of their e-discovery better practices now that they're bringing more of this in-house and learning from is, looking for more upstream information management opportunities. And this is everything from file share cleanup, again, that might be part of an M&A or divestiture, but even just as part of, moving to a better information governance scenario, perhaps bringing in a repository or archive technology and, moving away from the Wild West of file shares. So this includes things like data remediation, making sure that we're cleaning up the drives of sensitive information that don't belong in these unsecured locations, or even just deduplication, one of the areas of low-hanging fruit for a lot of organizations in terms of dispensing with unnecessary storage devices and just getting rid of some of the confusion about opening up the wrong version of a document. And we see a lot of opportunity on the horizon for much more automation around the classification of business records, taking the burden off of business users and being able to get things into the right kind of either file plan or apply the right kind of metadata to kick off the appropriate life cycle for the kind of content that it is. Look at much more areas of automation here. And of course, as you mentioned just a moment ago, mining some of that legal hold data for business improvement efforts. Very few organizations that I've been talking to so far are really beginning to mine the potential of, as they move to, let's say, more automated approaches to collection, preservation, start to mine those tools for the data inside of them, meaning that identifying, particular sales teams or product areas that are, at higher risk for litigation than others, and trying to learn from that and feedback those learnings into more of a continuous improvement approach. So I think this is a huge, very ripe area for organizations to make more intelligent use of the data they collect as part of bringing e-discovery in-house.
Indeed, and honestly, Cheryl, this is one of the places we find really most companies start with. So in this maturation in their information governance discipline, some of these low-hanging fruit projects are the first ones you can tackle. Doing data remediation is really no different than an e-discovery workflow, right? You're just simply finding stuff that's valuable or relevant. Relevant in this case for data remediation means to a particular record class or subject. And so most companies already have the skill set, they already have the technologies in place, and so we're finding lots of data remediation, which is a really exciting thing because it requires companies to decide what's important to the company. And as you said, a lot of work around changing their record classification scheme to fit the new big data era. And so it's not 512 record classes, but much more sophisticated. And the auto classification of data is another really exciting place we're seeing as well, that these technologies, especially these predictive analytical technologies, can, soon after data is created, classify it into large buckets of record classes, and that brings a huge amount of control over data, reduces e-discovery costs, reduces risks. It's really interesting to watch how these things are developing as this maturity around IG comes about.
Absolutely. And, in our Forrester research, it's really interesting that we see in 2013, we see that obviously something's hot here. The data that we've been collecting back to 2011, you look at the data from 2011, 2012, the level of interest in, IT decision makers around e-discovery was relatively flat. If you look at the 2011 and 12 data, very similar types of interest profiles. But then take a look at the data from late 2013. Basically, the number of IT decision makers who are putting e-discovery on their either critical or high priority list for investments over the next 12 months basically doubles. And so, I think this is a pretty good indicator that organizations are becoming more sophisticated about e-discovery. They're learning where they have the capabilities to bring some activities in-house, especially around things like collection, and that initial ability to identify the right stakeholders, leaning less on external consultants for some of this nuts and bolts kind of work, and being prepared to invest in the tools to be able to do more of this more efficiently in-house. So definitely some growing opportunity here.
Yeah, we're seeing the same thing. So we did a very similar study at the IG Initiative, and the results are just coming out at iginitiative.com. And I agree, something's happened in the last really 18 months to a year, where I think it's this convergence of big data and e-discovery and frankly some of the pressures coming off of e-discovery and turning it more into a considered process, where more business leaders are simply understanding how they can get at information better and being able to bring some of that in-house as part of a larger IG initiative. It's reading some of these benchmarking interviews you did with 30 or 40 IT professionals around the world and how they went about it and morphing into this IG space is really quite stunning over the last 12 months.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, we also survey some of the decision makers, IT decision makers, around things like content management. And the interesting part is on this particular chart, we asked the question, what are the biggest challenges facing content management in your organization today? And number one response, and our early results from 2014 are showing very similar patterns, is that lack of coordinated governance. Now, if we go back to previous year's data, the top challenges were often things like I don't have budget, or I lack executive support, I don't have the expertise, the technology is too hard. It sounds like we're actually solving a lot of those more kind of nuts and bolts problems inside our organizations, and we're now moving to solving higher order problems, such as really coming up with strategies and governance around how we manage our, whether it's structured or unstructured data.
Yeah.
We also, Forrester does some joint research every year with the Records and Information Management Association, ARMA, and this is a data point from our survey just at the end of 2013. We asked the question, and this is primarily a records information management decision maker here, what are some of the top challenges facing your records management programs? And we're getting responses like staffing, developing skills in-house as a top response, the lack of IT, legal, compliance, alignment. We also see, similar statement around, synchronizing the e-discovery, records management, and archiving efforts. So again, these these alignment issues, these skill set issues, these connecting the dot issues across business teams are really where we're seeing some of the challenges in organizations now. So I think, as we start to see the concept of information governance really move up into the executive awareness ranks, and we see that the technologies that we're investing in as part of e-discovery are able to tackle more of these broader information management upstream challenges, I think we're going to start to see some improvement here. But right now, getting those right skills, getting people on the same page is where organizations continue to struggle. We also talked to some IT professionals, and this is a survey that we did talking to information architects last year. And the question was, does your organization have a formal information strategy? And number one answer, unfortunately, was no. So 42% coming and saying that we don't have a formal strategy. What's interesting is that if we ask the question, do we have a formal strategy for managing structured data, we see that we have a little bit more sophistication. So 20% have a strategy for structured data, so coming out of ERP systems or general accounting systems, but not for content. So that that traditional Achilles heel, things like email and our Office documents, things residing in SharePoint, for example, file shares. This is often where it starts to get neglected. Now, many of us are already familiar with the electronic discovery reference model, and really interesting to see the update made just recently. Putting information governance as really the foundation at that left-hand side of a solid e-discovery strategy. I think what's really important here is, if we kind of go back to some of the initial definitions, we have to really start looking at, what do we mean by ESI in the world of e-discovery, and ensuring that we see that it does branch into structured and unstructured information. So, a lot of us are looking at the low-hanging fruit around things like email, file shares, personal data on laptops, desktops, mobile. But, we do have these growing number of sources, these increasingly complex set of sources that are coming from marketing automation systems, that are coming from customer service databases, that are coming from new generation ERP systems, perhaps, that are now residing in cloud instances rather than on traditional on-premises applications. At Forrester, we see that there's a real interesting appetite right now for infrastructure refresh, and that's moving away from heavy footprint, kind of architected in the 1990s, enterprise applications to newer generation ones, often residing in cloud or managed services with a vendor being hosted. So these all are new sources of collection identification opportunities that we do need to be aware of. So that importance of really being at the table and understanding, as our business stakeholders and IT stakeholders are making these infrastructure decisions, how does that impact our e-discovery landscape, and how are we investing in the practices and technologies to keep pace with some of those changing sources or storage locations. But of course, our data shows that even though we're investing in much more modern communication techniques, whether it's instant messaging, mobile, social, etc., email continues to dominate business communication. 66% of the information workers who use email every day, according to our data, says that they're using it to relay, quote, critical information. So these are clearly potential sources of business records that we need to be able to find and address very quickly if we need to do that to respond to a legal order or perhaps a regulator, etc. 62% of it are using it to communicate decisions. Again, that's kind of classic definition of a record in many organizations. And of course, 52% of it use it to share documents. So although the communication patterns are beginning to shift, new devices and approaches are coming in the market, email continues to be kind of that lifeblood of business communication.
And we're seeing that too, Cheryl. The email is just ubiquitous. It's just incredibly important to a company. But what's interesting is now we're finally starting to be able to distill the valuable information out of it at an earlier stage. Study after study has shown that, after, I think one says 17 days, one says 30 days, email loses its value, its currency very quickly. And yet, because we've had difficulties in pulling out the valuable stuff, companies keep it for a year, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And that has been a huge burden on companies, not only efficiency, but that's what really drives up e-discovery costs. And so we're working with many companies, probably a dozen of these going on now, where we are remediating giant repositories, terabytes worth of emails they've kept because they haven't been able to distill the information out. But now through some of these more analytical approaches and technologies, you can keep what is truly important to the company over a long period of time and then get rid of everything once what I call the froth period is kind of over, where you're working on projects every day. And so email, while it's incredibly important to the business of a company, the burden side of it has been really enormous, but it's nice to watch that starting to come down.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about the whole hold and collection process, I mean, we're seeing a lot more organizations express interest in bringing these tools in-house. And I think one of the key points here is that, as we become more comfortable with the concepts of e-discovery and operationalize more of the practices and are able to respond more quickly, organizations are really now looking for ways to reduce the burden on those custodians. I mean, these executives, these are C-levels, these are customer-facing teams, writing agreements, dealing with customer service issues, launching new products to market, and the approach of doing being invasive in terms of taking their laptop for half a day and these kinds of approaches, they just don't scale anymore when workforces are remote, people are mobile, and we're so dependent on our devices to get work done. So I think we're now looking at ways to use technologies to become much more behind the scenes, transparently engage with customers or custodians, and make sure that we're not impeding the day-to-day flow of business. I think that's one of the areas of e-discovery perhaps we haven't really looked at in as much depth as we could is, how do we minimize its impact on day-to-day revenue and customer engagement. And then, of course, continuing to move up the stack and learn about, well, how are we going to be able to address the emerging pockets of big data, mobile data, social data, and even sources of cloud as more and more enterprise applications and content resides in those locations.
And we're seeing that too, Cheryl, like the idea that, and this to me is more evidence of kind of a maturity that is coming across corporations to govern their information more effectively. Going out to custodians and collecting data from them, having to interrupt business to get at data is just inefficient. And so with more maturity comes more facile ways of getting at this data. Part of the information governance idea is that when you have new sources of information or consider new initiatives, that you understand the information that's involved and you have plans in place to collect from it or otherwise access it for reasons other than its particular business purpose. And so we're seeing more companies start to stop and think not only about their e-discovery processes, but also their overarching IT processes so that they kind of build in the e-discovery piece of it as they're considering it.
Mm-hmm. And just to that data point, again, this is coming from the research that we did jointly with ARMA last year. As a general rule of thumb, the newer the content type, the least likely an organization is to have it under some kind of retention management program. So these newer sources of ESI, these newer sources of customer communication are often being neglected. The chart that you see here now reflects the answer who's not interested in putting some of these new content types under control. And top of the list, social or collaboration sites such as Jive, Yammer, and Chatter. Now, what's interesting there is these examples are, enterprise social networks. So this is where, this is where discussions about customer accounts, Chatter is part of Salesforce happening. This is how we're planning to, run our business. This is where we're having some of these internal discussions, and business decisions are being made here. Next on the list, cloud-based file sharing systems, followed by instant messaging, and then external social media, such as Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. So, we're pretty good at managing the retention of content sitting on things like desktops, laptops, but not very good at some of these newer sources of business content.
Yeah, and Cheryl, as you and I were talking prior to this event, you made a great point that this is like us reliving the email situation of 10 years ago. Many of us who have practiced for a long time remember that email was just kind of shoved under the carpet, that it was too complicated, we didn't have the technology, we weren't sure how to deal with it, and so it just really wasn't addressed. And that's, we run the risk of living through that mistake again, because we all know that some of this information is highly critical to a company in a case. And yet it is rarely really considered, not just in the records management space, but even in the e-discovery space. And it can, if not considered, it can be a gigantic problem later on in a case. And so, what we really encourage companies to do is to have an overarching information governance perspective and understand that the people in their companies create this information, and that information has value, as well as needs to be considered for e-discovery purposes, and building that into their litigation response protocols.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you reminded me of that example, because I remember when email first came into the workplace, and people would say, well, this is just used for kind of casual communication. No one's really going to make a business decision via email. And we have the same kind of comments about things like social media today. So, cloud, social, mobile are driving new discovery challenges. We're seeing the rise of many cloud-based content creation and collaboration environments. Many of you have heard the terms, systems of engagement, systems of record. But, as we're beginning to engage with our colleagues and often even our customers and partners in some of these co-creation workspaces that often are hosted or cloud-based, it means that we are introducing some of the complexities. We need to be able to know where these conversations and these document creation activities are happening and be aware of where to go to find them. Mobile devices and the whole bring your own device movement that many organizations are implementing or at least experimenting with includes complexity, because we're seeing a whole mix of different kinds of tablet or phone devices coming into the workplace. And of course, big data now is beginning to throw a wrench into some of the traditional retention rules. I mentioned the example earlier of an organization who had typically been disposing of certain kind of customer data after a period of time because it had no business value. And that definition of, quote, business value to drive retention periods may actually be changing in light of some of the new analytic capabilities coming from the world of big data. What had no value 5 years ago may in fact start delivering value because we're able to include it and merge those insights with other forms of data and get a bigger picture of what's happening with our customers, our business, etc. So organizations, we know, are continuing to look for to find efficiencies and develop consistent practices around e-discovery. So as organizations bring more of these activities in-house, we are developing in-house knowledge and corporate memory to continually improve the way that we approach discovery and investigative tasks. Companies that are beginning to use technology to automate this are reusing work done for previous matters, including automation of recollection and the ability to use ESI or use matching criteria so that you don't have to go and do searches on laptops or desktops repeatedly. You can use technology to automate some of that recollection if things that meet the criteria actually are being brought into the environment. So what it means, just to wrap up and move on to the rest of the presenters, e-discovery we see is a set of processes. It's not just one. We see that vendors are addressing the user experience of some of these technologies to better serve non-technical roles, including the streamlining of collection so that business users who need to focus on customer-facing activities are not being disrupted unnecessarily. And we see that data from in-house e-discovery activities can be better leveraged for input into continuous improvement practices, so helping to proactively address problems at the source, especially when there's patterns of inappropriate behavior that can be easily mined from some of these legal hold and collection technologies. All right. Well, thanks very much, and I'll hand it over to Jeremy now.
Thank you, Cheryl and Bennett. I think that was very interesting, illuminating. Today, or next, we're going to talk about some specific challenges around collecting that data of which we've been speaking about. First, we just want to mention some of the impacts of what we've been talking about, big data, and how information governance or lack thereof can be its own challenge. especially when it comes to identifying and preserving or collecting that ESI. And of course, as the volume of data grows, it creates its own risks. So if if your traditional approach is to just go out and preserve everything and hold on to it indefinitely, not only are you consuming resources at the company, but you're also keeping in those documents that, if properly remediated, will not come back out later and haunt you and arise in a related case or in a related discovery. So
this is really one of the things that we're seeing, Jeremy, as being one of the most impactful, right? Companies are simply realizing that they have too much information on hand, and that information, especially because it's usually what we call dark data, they don't have good visibility into it, has no value to them except potentially negative value in an e-discovery or a regulatory action. And so one of the parts of the survey that we did, the Information Governance Initiative, was on what are the projects that companies are working on now. And 53% of respondents said that remediating data, eliminating data, and classifying that was valuable to them was their #1 priority.
I love that phrase, dark data. That's such a great phrase. I've heard you mention it before, and that gets exactly to what we're describing. Not only do you not know what's out there, but it still exerts mass and gravity and can pull you in and lead to disaster. And of course, one other impact here is by reducing the scope of collection, the less data that is involved in going into the e-discovery case, overall that can have a pretty dramatic reduction in costs on what is being processed or hosted and reviewed. So the goal of having just the right amount of data is what we're going to talk about next. So, of course, one of those key technological challenges, and we don't need to spend a lot of time here because most of what we've been talking about today has been about it, is just purely on the volume of data. So that adds its own specific technology complications when it comes to getting access to that data, moving it from point A to point B, from the custodian's possession in the case of their laptops to your processing vendor or to your own e-discovery tools in-house. So just getting that data and then managing that data. So of course, storage costs have decreased. It's pretty easy to hang on to it for as long as you need, but that does involve a certain amount of juggling of your technology to keep up with everything. Access is its own particular challenge. So whether we're referring to a corporation trying to collect data from, say, remote employees who maybe are traveling or in distant offices, or if we're speaking to law firms and service providers who are running collections on behalf of their corporate clients, getting access to that data, having to navigate around well-intentioned security measures and firewalls present their own challenges. And so quite frequently the solutions that are available involve just sending somebody on site with a specific set of hardware or a kit to go out and do the collection, or to implement some large-scale enterprise software that can help facilitate the collection. But both of those approaches end up causing disruption. And Cheryl had mentioned that, I think, on a previous slide. These people who were collecting and placing on hold the most are usually the most involved, the busiest people at the organization. Frequently the executives and others. I like to call them frequent flyers. So good technology needs to address that. We don't want to be constantly putting the CEO or the CIO on hold and sending them too many notices or collecting from their data so frequently that they're just unable to get any work done.
You know, and Jeremy, I got to tell you, you know me, I'm very much into all the technology that is in the e-discovery space, and I am more than happy to talk about those that work. I am more excited about this collection tool that you guys have developed than I have a long time about tools. This problem that we have about getting to employees and third parties is just a headache. It's now become really quite simple relatively to get email, to get data from servers. But when you start going to individual custodians, especially when they're remote or they're salespeople or third parties, it's just a headache, and it's very expensive and very cumbersome and disruptive. Having access to a tool that allows me to have someone log in and be able to scan what's on their computer and make decisions right there while you're interviewing them has greatly impacted what we do. This is a really brilliant piece of technology you guys have developed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So another point here, I think, and this touches on getting access. I mean, these are all interrelated. Is a scalable process. So frequently, because of the technologies that are out there and just the more traditional process, there ends up being these bottlenecks where the legal department or the case team relies on a certain set of specialists. They're the only ones who are able to use collection software with a real focus on IT type of users, and that can limit its how much data can be collected. So having a good solution that allows you to scale very easily, be able to have the work done by, let's say, project managers or through lit support, and not require any, expensive or in-depth training and certification programs, can really help you run more collections in-house without having to rely on third parties and all the costs that go with that. I think, Bennett, another key point that you would agree with would be just having visibility into the data. A lot of what we've been talking about has been the sheer number and volume of data sources, let alone how much data is contained within them. And just knowing where those things are from an identification perspective, as well as knowing what the contents are, can present its own challenge. So certainly there are tools that make it so you can assess data that is in, for example, Exchange or in the cloud. But how do you get visibility into one of the most common sources of ESI, just an individual's workstation, their PC or their laptop?
And especially early enough, right, Jeremy? The way that the e-discovery law has developed is to give us a lot of relief around proportionality, that we can put together targeted, iterative approaches to discovery. That requires doing your homework and getting at data faster and earlier so you can make intelligent and reasonably defended decisions about, I'm only going after this data and not that data. I need to sample this source or that term or these people. And normally I haven't been able to do that when it comes to local computer data or even servers, right? Because I usually have to go through IT and get a directory report, and it's this long, convoluted process. With this, I can literally, while I'm doing custodian interviews, I can have somebody click on something and immediately scans their drive and anything they're connected to. And then when they're telling me, oh, I saved my stuff here or I saved my stuff here, I can identify it immediately. I can do search parameters around kinds of files and folders and subfolders. And so it gives me so much more to my defensibility strategy for a piece that I usually had to put off until I collected data.
I think that's a great point. You know, how can one determine what is reasonable or proportional if you're applying your criteria after the fact? If you've already gone out and collected everything and then begin to narrow it down through different searches or through analysis, it's already a little late in the game. We've already now got that data. Now we're going to have to do something with it. So being able to provide that visibility even prior to collection, while the data is still in its in its source system, is, I think, one of the key goals that someone should look for in a in a collection product. Within relativity, we have the ability to first scout a computer. And this is an image of actually my laptop, where we're seeing information about the computer, what domain is it on, what type of hardware, and other details about those data sources. What file shares does the custodian have access to? And then being able to either with the custodian in a more collaborative fashion, like Bennett was saying, along with the custodian interview process, or on your own, asynchronously, not in real time, being able to assess the data on the custodian's data sources and make intelligent decisions about what to collect, either based on how the data is organized and its file structure. Maybe you want to grab everything in the tax holdings folder on their My Documents, or to run searches based on date ranges or file types, and be able to assess and know in advance how much data you're getting and what its contents are.
And just the speed of this, I mean, I love the fact that you've got this interface, because it does give me an idea of what's exactly, it looks just like their Explorer, right? I can see exactly what they're connected to. And I love that I can choose particular folders or documents or file types or dates, and I've got graphics that tell me exactly what's there. And then honestly, with a push of a button, I can collect it somewhere or even image it. One of my custodians, they had a thumb drive, and thumb drives are a huge pain. He connects it to his computer, and I literally clicked a button and it imaged it in a few minutes. And so it's just the ability that this has given me without having to go on site has really been really unparalleled.
Excellent. Just a few best practices for targeting the right data. One, of course, is make sure you have all the right people involved, the case team, the line of business leaders. I would add, in some situations, even the custodians, although there may be situations where you need to collect data without involving the custodian. But certainly there are situations where that would be useful. Another point, and Bennett made this earlier, but collecting only what is reasonable and proportional. Sometimes that includes making a complete image of a hard drive. If that is what is reasonable and proportional for the case, then by all means go ahead and get the slack space and the deleted files and the zeros and ones. But in the majority of situations, probably you can get away with collecting far less and only grabbing what is specific to this type of situation, whether it's an IP case or HR issue or whatever it may be. And then by filtering or focusing on only the right data earlier in the process, the overall funnel of e-discovery is going to be reduced. There'll be less data to process, which will save time, less data for review, where most of the e-discovery costs arise if you're using human review. So a targeted approach to collection when forensic imaging is not required is a great way to reduce your overall scope, both costs, risks, time, a number of factors like that. So I want to thank my panelists very much, Cheryl and Bennett. Thank you for joining us and speaking today, and of course to all of our attendees. Really appreciate you joining us and spending some time with us. Hope this information was valuable, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you.